my last video, we looked at Queen Elizabeth I's achievements, the stability, the diplomacy, the cultural flourishing, and the triumph over the Spanish Armada. It's easy to see why Elizabeth is considered by many to be England's greatest monarch, and her reign has been remembered as a golden age. But, as with any period of history, that's not the full picture. Beneath the surface, there were real challenges, particularly for the common people. Although England definitely became stronger and more prosperous overall, that wealth was not shared equally. In fact, for many, life became harder. There was rising inflation, poor harvests, and a growing population putting pressures on the resources. At the same time, traditional industries like the wool trade began to decline. The result was a widening gap between rich and poor. Earlier in Elizabeth's reign, poverty was often seen as a personal failing, but as conditions worsened, attitudes began to shift. By the later years of her rule, the government introduced poor laws to provide some level of support for those in need. So, while the Elizabethan age might have been one of opportunity and prosperity for some, for others it was a time of hardship and uncertainty. And then there was Ireland. Elizabeth's reign saw significant conflict there, including the Desmond rebellions and later the 9 Years' War led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. These weren't small local disturbances, they were prolonged and costly wars. The 9 Years' War alone required tens of thousands of English troops and placed a huge financial strain on the crown. For the people of Ireland, Elizabeth's reign was not a golden age. It was a period marked by violence, rebellion, and repression. And there's another aspect of Elizabeth's reign that we need to consider when looking at its wider impact, and that is England's early involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. This was not yet the large-scale system that would develop in later centuries, but it was beginning. English sailors and privateers were already looking beyond Europe, not just for exploration and trade, but for profit in all its forms. One of the key figures here was Sir John Hawkins, who in the 1560s led voyages to West Africa, where enslaved Africans were captured or purchased and then transported across the Atlantic to be sold in the Spanish colonies. These voyages were highly profitable, and they were not carried out in isolation. Hawkins had support at the highest levels, and Elizabeth herself invested in at least one of his expeditions, even lending him a ship. This is an important reminder that England's growing power and global reach during Elizabeth's reign did not come without consequences. The same expansion that brought trade, wealth, and opportunity for some was also connected, even at this early stage, to exploitation and human suffering. And then there's religion, which was so carefully balanced at the start of Elizabeth's reign. Think of her middle way. That also became dangerous for some later in her reign. In 1570, Elizabeth was excommunicated by the Pope, and this changed everything. The Pope's bull not only declared Elizabeth illegitimate, it also released her subjects from their allegiance to her and effectively encouraged rebellion against her. From that point on, Catholics in England were no longer simply people with a different faith. They were seen as a potential threat to the state. And Elizabeth and her government responded with increasingly harsh measures. Laws were introduced against recusancy being the refusal to attend Protestant services. And laws were also made against Catholic priests, particularly Jesuits. And this is where things became especially severe. In 1585, Parliament passed a law which made it illegal for Catholic priests ordained abroad to remain in England. They were given a limited time to leave the country. If they stayed or returned, they were considered traitors. And, of course, the punishment for treason was death. This law didn't just target priests themselves. Anyone who sheltered or helped a Catholic priest could also face execution. So for Catholics in England, this created an impossible situation. Priests were essential for the sacraments and the practice of their faith, but seeking them out or even offering them refuge could cost you your life. It was an incredibly difficult and dangerous time for those trying to remain loyal both to their faith and to their Queen, to the Pope and Elizabeth. The Queen who'd sought moderation now ruled in a far more dangerous and suspicious world. Then there's Elizabeth herself. Not the icon, not Gloriana, but the woman behind the image. She was undoubtedly intelligent, charismatic, and politically astute. She understood power, she understood image and persuasion better than most rulers of her time. But she was also complex and at times difficult. She could be bad-tempered, jealous, and deeply controlling. She expected absolute loyalty from those around her and reacted strongly when that loyalty was challenged. We see this in her relationships with those closest to her, her anger at secret marriages, her long-lasting grudges, and her complicated favouritism towards figures like Robert Dudley and later the Earl of Essex. And her tendency towards indecision could also frustrate her advisors, although, as we've seen, that hesitation was sometimes a deliberate political strategy. So Elizabeth wasn't just Gloriana. She was human, capable of brilliance, but she also had her flaws. So was Elizabeth I's reign a golden age? Well, in many ways, yes, of course it was. It brought stability after decades of upheaval. It saw the flourishing of culture, the growth of England's influence, and the strengthening of national identity. But it wasn't a golden age for all of her subjects. For many, it was a time of poverty, conflict, and fear. And understanding both sides of Elizabeth's reign, it allows us to move beyond the myth and beyond the propaganda and see the reality of the Elizabethan world and the remarkable, complicated woman who ruled it. Thank you so much for following me, and please do click subscribe. I so want to get to 100,000 subscribers this year, and of course do press like if you've enjoyed it and check out my other videos too. I'll see you very soon. Bye bye.